did it. Hi, guys. I'm so happy to finally be here. I tried to set up that during my last stream, and the keys were the same, and I tried to get a new key, and it didn't work great. But it's fixed now, and look, he was watching me. He was watching me that whole time. But anyway, let's get to OJ. No, it's not set to 1.25, so I'm going to press play and then do that.
Ian, Edward Blake, Russell Higuchi, Higuchi, George Sensabaugh, Sensabaugh, and Henry Ehrlich.
Speed good.
Yes.
Have you also read and relied upon an article in the Journal of Forensic Science entitled Polymerase Chain Reaction Amplification and Human Leukocyte, Leukocyte, Antigen Oligonucleotide, Oligonucleotide, typing on biological evidence samples, casework experience?
Is that the one with Blake as the lead author?
Yep, it's the authors are Edward Blake, Jennifer Mihalovich, Mihalovich, Russ Higuchi, Sean Walsh, and Henry Ehrlich.
Yes.
Have you also read and relied upon, and the testimony we'll be presenting soon, an article entitled Analysis of Genetic Markers in Forensic DNA Samples Using the Polymerase Chain Reaction in Analytical Chemistry, 1991. The authors are Rebecca Reynolds, George Sensabaugh, and Edward Blake.
Yes.
Have you read and relied upon a chapter in Forensic Science Handbook, Volume 3 by Richard Saperstein, 1993, entitled DNA Analysis in Biological Evidence, Applications of the Polymerase Chain Reaction by George Sensabaugh and Edward Blake?
Yes.
Have you also read and relied upon an article entitled, or a chapter entitled, Applications of the Polymerase Chain Reaction in Forensic Science, the authors of which are Russell Higuchi and Edward Blake, and that's in the Banbury Report, number 32?
Yes, I have.
Okay, Mr. Sims, are you, let's focus on PCR for a moment. Is it your opinion that a typing error in the PCR process is more likely to result in a false exclusion than an inclusion?
Yes.
Okay. And have you read and considered and relied upon the casework article for that proposition?
Yes. As well as my own understanding.
Could you explain the basis for your opinion that a typing error in the PCR process is more likely to result in a false exclusion than an inclusion?
Yes. The basis for that is that if one obtains a result that is a false positive, then that sort of result would be more likely to exclude somebody than to include somebody in most instances.
Could you be a little more descriptive of how that might occur during the PCR typing process?
I would object that this is vague and without foundation at this point.
Well, for example, if one were to test a given blood stain against a particular individual may, his or her type may occur, say, in 1 in 10 or something like that, maybe 1 in 20 with a DQ alpha, for example. And so if you're generating at random wrong results, then it's unlikely.
I'm not just going to let that go. I can't believe they object to that. They are the ones that keep bringing it up. How could they object to... Okay, that's fine.
That it would match that particular individual. It's more likely that it would match, the type would be to match somebody else.
Motion to strike.
Okay. Mr. Sims, is it your opinion that the application of PCR technology in the forensic context is in any way different than it is in the diagnostic context?
Objection. No foundation to this.
Sustain.
Mr. Sims, is it your opinion that any of the properties of forensic DNA samples are unique or strike that. Is it your opinion that any of the properties of the kinds of forensic samples that your lab encounters are unique to forensic science or different than clinical setting?
Objection.
Foundation, sustain.
Mr.
You have
Sims?
some questions about his familiarity with.
Sure. Are you familiar in a general context with the kinds of, or have you read the casework article?
Yes.
Okay. Would it help to refresh your recollection? Is that discussed, the uniqueness or the difference of forensic samples in the casework article, the lead author of which is Edward Blake?
Objection. The foundation is to this witness's expertise to review that point. Overruled.
Your question again, please.
The question about whether forensic samples are different than clinical samples.
That's not clinical. Overruled.
Is it discussed in that article?
Yes, I believe it is. as I
Okay.
recall.
Would it help to refresh your recollection if you reviewed? I can direct you to a page in that article if you would.
Yes.
Page 721, can I show it? Be on page 721 if you'd read the paragraph
My
on the bottom.
my objection is,
I know, what's your objection? What's the legal grounds?
no
One word.
foundation for this witness.
Overruled.
What, can I state it?
Overruled.
No,
Sit down.
No? All right.
Yes, excuse me. What Dr. Blake and the other,
No, question is, does that refresh your recollection as to whether or not there's any correlation between the medical diagnostic application or the forensic application?
yes, it does refresh my recollection.
Next question.
And do you have an opinion on that subject?
Yes, I do.
Overruled.
Can I also have which page you're referring to?
721,
Of which article now?
towards the bottom of the casework article?
Which one? 721?
Yes.
Proceed.
Oh, I'm sorry, Your Honor. Do you have an opinion on that subject?
Yes, the point of this is that forensic samples may be mixtures, they may be degraded, but these kinds of samples are also encountered by clinical workers using PCR technology.
Objection. Move to strike this answer, this witness's answer, about what's found in clinical technology.
Overruled.
And is your opinion based on having your recollection refreshed by reading the bottom of page 721 of Dr. Blake's casework article?
Well, I already had some opinion on that, but specifically with regards to the article, yes.
Okay. Now, just as an aside, have you read the NRC report that came out 3 years ago?
Yes, I have.
Have you relied on the NRC report in any way for any of the opinions you've expressed to this moment?
No.
And do you intend to rely on the NRC report in any way for any of the opinions you'll express for the next several moments?
No.
Could I have my book back? Could you define, as best you can, the term contamination in the crime scene forensic DNA context so the jury can appreciate the discussion we're going to have?
Yes, there are a variety of ways of looking at contamination. One would be fundamentally, for example, at a crime scene where you may have mixtures of bodily fluids. Blood from two different individuals could land together, that sort of thing, or end up in a garment situation. That would be one form of contamination. Another form of contamination would be the concern one would have in the laboratory. In other words, if somebody is mishandling samples, then that could lead potentially to contamination as one DNA is transferred to another DNA. And then finally, the type of contamination that we are most worried about with PCR and that we have to take special precautions for is what is called PCR product contamination. And that's because this process of PCR, as Dr. Cotton explained, generates large numbers of these DNA segments that are of a particular short length that are considered to be PCR product now. And by generating those large numbers, you want to make sure that that material doesn't in any way contaminate your original source material or your extracted DNA.
And do you have an opinion about whether or not, generally speaking, there are adequate ways to control against those three areas of contamination?
Well,
Objection to the former question.
Overruled.
I think there's two responses here. One is that there are ways to control for the contamination. There are also ways of monitoring for that contamination. And both of those are important aspects with regards to contamination, both the monitoring as well as the precautions.
And I want to direct your attention to the chapter by Sensible and Blake in the Saperstein article. Is the subject of those areas of contamination, which you've just described for the jury, is that discussed in that article?
Yes, it is.
Okay, do you remember the entire discussion that occurs on pages 441 and 442 of that subject?
I haven't memorized it, but I have a good knowledge of what they say.
Okay, would it help to refresh your recollection to review that?
Yes.
I just think he should ask a question first. And then if he needs his memory refreshed, then he can have the article.
You had a chance to review that?
Yes.
And so what is your opinion specifically about the kinds of controls that can safeguard against those forms of contamination?
My opinion about the types of controls?
Sure.
Well, they basically, their words basically mirror the things that I was talking about, where they, for example, they mention maintaining clean work areas, using gloves, changing gloves, that sort of thing. And then also they stress which controls should be run. They draw an analogy to the types of precautions that would be taken in an infectious disease situation or a laboratory handling infectious materials.
And do you have an opinion, based on your review of that article, that should contamination occur, it can be recognized?
Yes, in most cases it can.
And is that based on the article as well?
Yes.
This is an answer.
Seems crystal clear to me. Seems crystal clear that you can't just willy-nilly contaminate evidence.
We'll shift to another article that I described earlier, PCR Technology, Chapter 17, by Von Berldingen, Blake, Higuchi, Sensabaugh, and Ehrlich. Do you have an opinion about whether or not the most likely avenue for chance introduction of foreign DNA is during sample preparation?
I would agree with that.
Okay. And do you have an opinion, or is it your opinion that common sense precautions can safeguard against that?
Yes.
Okay. And do you recall whether or not that subject is discussed in the article I just described as Chapter 17?
Yes, that chapter has a good discussion of the contamination issue.
Okay. And do you agree that the presence of a contaminant is often readily apparent?
Yes.
Is it also your opinion that appropriate controls should be used that would indicate these situations of contamination?
Absolutely.
Sustained.
What opinion do you have, if any, about whether or not appropriate controls should be used that would indicate these situations of contamination?
The opinion I have is that those controls should always be run to monitor for contamination.
And what opinion, if any, do you have about whether or not negative controls, including extraction reagent blanks and unstained substrate controls, when possible, should be run for each batch of DNA isolations?
I agree with that, and that's what we do in my laboratory.
And what opinion do you have about whether or not the absence of a PCR product in these control reactions attests to the validity of the typing results derived from the evidence samples?
I would agree with that.
Do you have an opinion about whether or not it is desirable to have some form of redundant sample analysis in a given case?
I would agree it's desirable.
And generally speaking, do you recall whether or not those subjects are discussed in Chapter 17 that I've been referring to?
Yes, I know that chapter quite well.
Okay, but do you have it memorized?
No.
Would it help to refresh your recollection? I'll direct you to pages 215.
He hasn't indicated that his memory needs to be refreshed as to anything so far.
Do you remember whether or not those questions I just asked you specifically are addressed the way I asked you?
I believe those are in there, but it would refresh my memory to be sure that they're in there.
215, 216?
This is really not an appropriate way to refresh somebody's recollection. I don't believe it to be necessary at this point. Proceed.
Okay, and it's your recollection those are discussed in Chapter 17 that I just...
Yes.
You're a little late there,
Mr. Sims, let's talk about the validation study that we discussed at the very beginning by Comey and Bedoli.
Yes,
You have that one clear in your mind? You remember it was November 91?
yes.
And I just want you to focus for a moment on the kind that, was there a sample handling part of that study that's published and described in detail?
Yes, there was that was a major part of that article, or an important part of that article.
Okay, and do you rely on that in the way you perform your PCR analyses?
Yes,
Does it help you in deciding what safeguards to take against in-lab contamination or sample preparation contamination, to rely on that?
yes, it does.
And what is your opinion about sample-to-sample contamination in the laboratory? Is it possible for that to occur?
Is it possible? Yes, it is.
Okay, and the opinion that you've expressed is actually based on where that was demonstrated in that article, is that correct?
Yes, and
Objection vague as to samples, what kind of laboratory?
Okay, let's just open it up. What kinds of samples were handled in that case, and what sorts of conclusions were drawn from the possibilities of sample handling errors?
Objection vague foundations, which case?
Compound.
Do you have an opinion about the kinds of sample handling errors that can occur that can allow samples to cross-contaminate one another?
yes.
And is that opinion based on the sample handling portion of the casework article?
Well, and also our own experience in the laboratory with PCR and the experience of many other people using PCR.
Okay, let's focus on the article and what your opinion is based on having read the article. What sorts of sample handling errors is it your opinion can produce sample-to-sample contamination?
The sorts of concerns would be, for example, in that article they mentioned 2 wet blood stains being brought into contact with each other. That would be one example. There are other instances they attempted to deliberately contaminate certain stains in those articles, and they had difficulty doing that with blood stains of sufficient quality and quantity of DNA. They also did some samples where they looked at saliva and blood and that sort of thing, and how that might affect the contamination issue. I think the last thing one of the other things they looked at was whether or not cutting with scissors, cutting a blood stain, whether or not those scissors would transfer contamination.
Okay, let's focus on, there's actually a table that describes, in the Comey article, that describes their efforts to force samples to contaminate one another.
Yes, they list several scenarios in that table.
And based on having read that article alone, what sorts of sample-to-sample contamination were they able to induce?
As I recall, they were able to induce it when bloodstains were brought into contact with each other, actually touching each other. They were able to induce it with mixtures of saliva and blood, for example.
Okay, let's take those one at a time. When you say touching one another, are you referring to the dried stains that were stored together?
Well, I think they had a low-level, detectable low-level contaminant when dry. It was more of a problem when they're wet and touching each other, which one would obviously expect.
Okay, when you say touching, do you mean stored?
Stored together, yes.
In other words, put together and kept together?
That's my understanding.
Would it help to refresh your recollection if you looked at page 1639 of the article?
Yes.
Sure.
Okay.
Okay, and let's just talk about in that sample handling study, the 2 top categories, dried stains stored together and wet stains stored together.
Yes.
What were the results of those attempts to force cross-contamination?
Well, what they did was they took blood from 2 different sources, dried stains from 2 different sources, and tested one end and then tested the other to see which one may have contaminated the other. And with one of those, they saw no exchange. With the other one, they saw that there was a trace contaminant of one of the alleles onto the other stain.
Okay, and does the article describe how long they were actually stored together?
I don't recall them actually mentioning the time. I think it just mentions that they were stored together.
And you mentioned also, give us a general idea of what sorts of other experiments, sample handling experiments, the study was based on, where they tried to force cross-contamination between samples that were ultimately typed using the PCR DQ alpha system.
Yes. For example, they looked at the effects of perspiration. They didn't find any contamination from that. They also looked at small 1 microliter blood stains that they were handling, and they did not find any contamination from that. They had a small 1 microliter blood stain that they coughed over for 1 minute, and that produced no contamination. And by that I mean they know the type of the blood stain, they know the type of the cougher, and so they look to see whether or not the cougher's type ends up on the blood stain. They also did an experiment where they took small 1 microliter blood stains and scratched their head for 30 seconds to shed their dandruff over it to see if that would cause a contamination problem, and it did not. Then they also did some experiments where they actually mixed blood and saliva, and there, as one would expect, you could get a contamination. You would see the types from the blood and the saliva.
Okay. I think you used the word transfer or evidence transfer. What are we, or trace transfer? In this discussion, what do you mean by that?
Well, what I'm talking about is whether or not small contributions of contamination would show up in a blood stain.
And based on that study, the only two areas of trace transfer were wet stains stored together for some period of time.
Sustained.
Based on that study, were the only instances of typable DNA evidence transfer.
Sustained.
Okay. But the scissors, contaminated scissors, what was that again?
Yes,
Oral.
the blood stain was cut with scissors and the contamination was not detected. In other words, as I read the article, 2 stains in a row were cut with these scissors, and the scissors, after cutting the first stain's type did not show up in the second.
Okay. Mr. Sims, let's shift a little bit here, and let's talk about substrate controls in the context of the Comey article and in the context of the work that you did in this case, okay?
Okay?
Could you define a substrate control in the context of the kinds of samples that you typed in this case?
Yes, a substrate control, for example, if we talk about blood drops on a sidewalk, one would want to collect the blood stain and then to collect and sample an area, unstained area where there was no blood detected nearby the blood stain. That's a substrate control. So you're testing that particular substrate and you're testing it very close to where the blood stain is.
Okay. And then processing it as if it were a stain?
Yes, and then it goes through the entire process and you look to see if there's any types showing up in that substrate control.
Okay. And I believe a little while ago, relying on one of the Blake Sensabaugh articles, you defined 3 areas of sample cross-contamination?
Yes.
And it's my recollection, sample mixing in the field,
Yes.
contamination by investigators or by lab personnel.
Bleeding. Sustained.
What were those 3 categories again?
I mentioned the contamination in the field, in other words, mixed samples occurring in the field. I mentioned contamination occurring in the laboratory as these samples are either processed or extracted. And then finally, I mentioned PCR product contamination.
And that's after the PCR is amplified?
Yes.
Okay. Let's talk about the field sample mix-up. And what I want to do is discuss the implications of having substrate controls collected systematically in the field, okay?
Okay.
And the question is, if a criminalist systematically alternated between substrate controls and stains in the evidence collection process, what effect, if any, does the presence or the availability of the substrate control have as a safeguard against sample mix-up?
It's an important safeguard because it shows to me, if the substrate controls turn out to be negative, it shows to me that there is no cross-contamination from sample to sample. Because of the alternating structure of that collection process, one has a stain, then a substrate control that should turn up negative, then another stain, then another substrate control. So that monitors that between each one of those stains, you've got one of these substrate controls. And if that shows negative, then that indicates that you're unlikely to have contaminated the blood stains on either side of that control.
Okay. What effect, let's focus on the same context, as a safeguard against sample mix-up in the field, what effect does just simply collecting one stain at a time with its substrate control have as a safeguard against sample mix-up in the field?
Yes, I think that's an important safeguard because it means you're focused on one particular event and you're not likely then to be handling too many samples at once. You're just keeping track of one item at a time.
Let's move to the next category that you described, and that is contamination by investigators or laboratory personnel.
Okay.
Okay. What effect does the presence of substrate controls which typed clean.
Cheeky, I spent a lot of time remembering this case yesterday as I was just going about my day too. I don't know why. I mean, I think about the case, a bit, but yesterday, I don't know why everything reminded me of the OJ case yesterday. I think we're getting so close to the defense. I think we're all just getting ready for that. It's going to be really good.
Do not produce the type have as a safeguard against contamination by investigators or laboratory personnel.
Well, those are very important because you have to remember that if those are negative, in other words, they have no DNA, they're even more vulnerable to this contamination showing up than would a good blood stain be. In other words, a good blood stain might have so much DNA that you may not even see a trace amount of contamination with this PCR testing. But these substrate controls, if they're negative to begin with, they have no DNA, they're certainly going to be more vulnerable to showing any traces of contamination. So that's why they're important.
Okay. As long as they test clean,
As long as they test clean.
as they did in this case.
As all of the ones that we tested were negative, yes.
That was an
I'm gonna take a
objection?
break at this point. All right, ladies and gentlemen, please remember all of my admonitions to you. Do not discuss this case amongst yourselves. Do not form any opinions about the case. Do not conduct any deliberations till the matter has been submitted to you. Do not allow anybody to communicate with you with regard to the case. And we'll be in recess for 15. Newspaper article that the jurors brought to the court's attention appeared in a little blurb column regarding counsel's comments about various basketball teams. Did not go to the merits of the case, and I find this no harm, no foul. But I think it speaks to the diligence and integrity of our jurors, so I will convey to them the court's compliments. I take it there's no other comment or objection on behalf of the parties.
Your Honor, may I just make one inquiry? Have there been any other articles any other time since it's happened? It's the first time it's supposed to
First time it's happened.
All right.
Sit down.
Thank you.
Sit down.
Slip by. All right, secondly, I received over the
Sit down.
break 2 notes from
Sit
jurors.
down.
And they are indicating that there are individuals, regular attendees, meaning the media persons, and they give me seat numbers who are constantly talking in the courtroom and who are causing them to have difficulty in hearing the testimony. And they have given me the seat numbers of the persons who were in the last session who were talking constantly.
It wasn't
and disturbing
me.
them. And I'm going to have Ms. Hazlett identify the two
Oh,
individuals.
my
and those
mic
persons
is
will be banned from
on.
further attendance at the court.
Sorry.
All right, let's have the jury, please.
I hate this mute button so bad sometimes.
Mr. Harmon.
I mean,
Thank
it's
you,
a
Your Honor.
live stream. I can't fix
In
it.
discussing the
Nothing I can do.
the second subject of cross-contamination of samples when substrate controls were involved, we covered contamination by investigators and lab personnel. Is that right?
Yes.
And if the stains and the substrate controls were alternated systematically, would that provide a safeguard against cross-contamination?
Yes, it would.
And let's reflect back on the Comey article too, and remember the contaminated scissors attempting.
Oh,
Okay.
I assume this is foundational. to
Yes,
something
Your
else.
Honor, for injecting substrate
Please.
controls in there. If a forensic scientist were to use contaminated scissors that were contaminated with a quantity of DNA and alternate between substrate controls and evidence stains, would that provide any kind of a safeguard against cross-contamination of samples?
Yes, it would, because again, the scissors would be used on a blood stain, and then if there was any contamination, that should then be transferred, if there was contamination, it would be transferred to this substrate control, which would very likely show that contamination, and then that would be monitored before one would proceed then to the next blood stain. So if that substrate control in the middle turns out clean, that indicates that there was no contamination detected.
Okay. Let me just clarify a point, too, about the Comey article. Have you had a chance to look at it again during the break?
Yes.
Okay. And if you would, the two areas where there was cross-contamination between stains, could you tell us more about what kind of contact, if any, those stains had, both the wet and the dry?
Well, the article indicates that the two stains were actually touching each other. They were actually stored together in a way that they're touching each other, and that's the important point, is that they're in physical contact.
Now let's shift to the third area, and that is contamination within the laboratory. We've already discussed contamination by lab personnel in sample preparation, and I think you talked about contamination by amplified product.
Yes,
Now, and you previously discussed the concept of negative controls as a
Yes.
safeguard against contamination by PCR product.
yes.
In addition to negative controls, and assuming they test clean, what are the implications of having substrate controls processed through the entire PCR process as a safeguard against contamination in the laboratory by amplified PCR product?
Yes, those, again, those substrate controls, if they had no DNA on them to begin with, would be most vulnerable to showing any contamination, whether it occurred from this handling effects, whether there was something in the laboratory, whether there was any PCR product contamination. And because they are treated in the same manner, they go through the entire process. And so that's an important control on the entire process, not just the collection, not just the extraction of the DNA, but all the way through the typing.
Okay. I'll strike that. You have actually, when you opened up all of the evidence in this case, have you documented the condition of the actual substrate controls that you previously enumerated when you talked about the results in this case?
Yes,
Okay. And do the substrate controls, are they all uniform in appearance for all the samples, all the substrate controls that you tested in this case?
no,
Is there a range in how they appear?
yes, there is.
And when you sample those substrate controls, let's assume they're not uniform. Some are discolored, some part is discolored, some appears clean.
Sustained. Rephrase the question.
In this case, if you saw a substrate control that parts of it were cleaner than others, what part did you sample to process through the entire PCR process?
Objection here is foundational with respect to making something hypothetical as opposed to specific. What he did.
Is the objection that it assumes facts that aren't in evidence yet?
All right, sure.
Sustained.
Did you sample all the substrate controls that you said you sampled in this case?
Yes,
Okay.
I think you asked him, did he document at the time of receipt, the substrate controls? And I guess the question would be, did he notice any differences between the substrates at that point?
Oh, I think I've asked a different question. I think I've moved on.
right.
And we'll come back. I haven't finished that area. Thank you, Your Honor. When you sampled the substrate controls, if one part of any of the control was dirtier, appeared dirtier than the other, which part did you sample?
Assumes facts aren't
Sustained.
specific about the controls.
Were there any such?
yes, there were, Your Honor.
Proceed.
And when you encountered such a substrate control, what did you do?
I took the dirtier, or what appeared to be the dirtier area in this case, as I can recall.
Why was that?
Well, I figured that probably received more of the environment. For example, if it was a sidewalk, it probably got better contact than maybe the other area of the substrate control.
And what would that, if that had happened, why would sampling the dirtier part of it have been important to you?
Well, that tells me that that's most likely the area that was most heavily, for example, may have some dirt or whatever is on that substrate, that I got a good area to test, in other words.
Okay, I'm going to direct your attention to just a couple of these substrate controls and see if you can describe how they appeared to you when you first observed them, okay?
Okay?
The substrate control for LAPD item 52, the drop out in the driveway at Bundy, do you have an independent recollection of how that appeared when you observed it and ultimately sampled it?
That one in particular, I believe I do have an independent recollection of.
And what is that?
Well, my independent recollection was that it was sort of pinkish.
And is that the only one that was pinkish that you recall?
That's the only one I recall that was pinkish, yes.
In fact, were most of them absent of any coloration or
Sustained.
were most of them, did they appear clean to the naked eye?
Still leading.
How did most of them appear to the naked eye?
Most of them appeared as pieces of white fabric.
Is that unusual?
Sustained.
foundation.
Sustained.
If you would, let's talk about substrate control 48, 48C. If you'd like, I can direct your attention to a page in your notes. Do you recall how that appeared when you examined it?
Not without looking at my notes.
Would it help to refresh your recollection if you looked at page 48 of your notes?
Yes.
Okay. What's your recollection of how 48 appeared?
The 48 control was our item number DNA 22. I noted there was some dark debris specks associated with the cloth, and I took those also for the extraction process.
Okay, do you recall what the control for item 50 looked like, the substrate control for item 50, which is farther back along the Bundy walkway?
Again, I'd have to look at my notes.
Would it help? It's on the same page there, 48.
Yes. I noted that it was a piece of whitish cloth with some brownish staining. I thought it may be some soiling.
Okay, and let's just shift to some others that look differently. For example, item 29, control. That's from the steering wheel of the Bronco.
Okay.
Would it help, do you remember what it looked like?
No.
Would it help to refresh your recollection if you looked at your notes on page 21?
Yes.
Okay, how did that appear?
That is generally just an irregularly shaped piece of white cloth.
Is that unusual to see a substrate control that looked like that?
No.
Okay. And do you have actually detailed notes of each and every other substrate control that you observed
Yes.
and photographs of them as well?
Yes.
And this is before you sample them?
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Sims, let's move on, if you will. I'd like to discuss the subject of degradation of DNA and cross-contamination, if you will.
Okay.
I want to give you a hypothetical and ask you some questions about the hypothetical. The hypothetical is that all of the Bundy walkway stains were collected and they were packaged in plastic bags. The substrate controls were collected systematically, alternating between the substrate control and the evidence stain. They were packaged in plastic bags. They were put in a truck for several hours, and they were brought back to the Los Angeles Police Department laboratory. They were put in the same box with items that were collected from Mr. Simpson's residence that were also collected systematically with substrate controls. For starters, is it possible?
This hypothetical in that form, I think it misstates the evidence and its compound.
Okay, we've already described the Comey article, and you've described how, at least based on study, it is possible to cross-contaminate samples. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you've described the conditions under which cross-contamination can occur.
Yes.
Now, in that study, none of those samples were degraded. Is that right?
In my understanding in that study is that those were good quality blood stains, yes.
Now, do you have an opinion about whether or not just the coexistence of those, and I'm sorry, let me withdraw that question. Let's assume that there were stains from Mr. Simpson's residence, which in fact were from him, contained his DNA, okay? Is it possible, scientifically possible, in your opinion, for those stains, merely by their coexistence in a room, for them to cross-contaminate one another?
Sustained. Rephrase the question.
These stains from two residences are collected along with their systematic substrate controls.
Okay.
They're brought into a room where they remain for a period of time. They're not in contact with one another. Okay, so far?
Okay.
Is it possible, based on that information alone, for those stains to have cross-contaminated one another?
I don't know about the rules on hypotheticals in terms of, but
You're speaking, counsel.
all right.
Did you have to use the objection foundation?
Yeah.
That assumes facts that aren't in evidence?
Yes.
Right, that objection's overruled.
I'm
Proceed.
sorry?
Overruled.
Thank you, Your Honor. You may answer that question.
The question I would first have is how were those stains packaged at this point?
They were initially left in plastic bags. Well, actually, let's start off. They're in a box together.
Okay.
And they're in coin envelopes that are folded over and they're in plastic bags in those coin envelopes that are folded over. Is it possible for those samples to cross-contaminate one another?
No, I would say no.
Okay. Let's move to the evidence room. Now, moving that box where you don't believe cross-contamination was possible into the evidence room, is it possible for those stains to have cross-contaminated one another and not cross-contaminated the substrate controls?
Sustained. You need some additional facts now that we're in the evidence processing room.
Excuse me, Your Honor?
You need some additional facts now that we're in the evidence
Sure.
processing room. It's also vague as to what stage.
And there are a lot of facts.
I've sustained the objection, counsel.
Okay. You've told us it's not possible, given that they're packaged up in a box in the truck.
Yes.
Okay. Does moving that box into a room and leaving it on the table, is it possible for those stains to have cross-contaminated one another?
Or we'll
Testimony.
Under those conditions, no.
Okay. Now, let's assume that those stains are now processed for drying. Okay. And that,
Objection to strike vague on processing.
Or we'll, he hasn't finished the question yet. I assume that that's next.
the processing for drying systematically alternates between the substrate controls and the evidence stains. And that
Objection to facts, not evidence.
Sustained.
if one were to systematically alternate between the substrate controls and the evidence stains,
Objection to facts, not evidence.
Or we'll,
and that the substrate controls ultimately were processed along with those stains and produced no typable results. Is it your opinion that those samples were cross-contaminated at that point?
Speculative, some facts, not evidence.
or we'll.
I would say there's certainly no evidence for that, and that I think those substrate controls would then provide a way of monitoring to show that that did not occur.
Let me add to that hypothetical that a known reference tube of Mr. Simpson's blood was kept in that room in a black plastic garbage bag. Okay?
Okay?
To the hypothetical you just answered. Is it possible for those samples to have been contaminated by that reference tube in the black plastic bag without contaminating the substrate controls?
No. I would follow that up, that in other words, you wouldn't get blood out of the plastic bag to begin with. That's the main point there.
Now, let me add to that. Let's accumulate to the next question. Let's assume that each and every stain that you tested along the Bundy walkway was degraded to the point where you were unable to type with any of the PCR methods, okay?
Okay?
And just add that to the hypothetical I just asked you. Is it possible for cross-contamination to have occurred in that setting without cross-contaminating the substrate controls?
Well, again, I would give the same answer, that the substrate controls provide evidence that that did not occur.
Let's move on. Are you familiar with how the Los Angeles Police Department processes evidence stains and substrate controls for drying?
I have some information on that, yes.
And let's assume, or is that information that they use the tube drying method
Yes.
and place them back in the coin envelope
Yes.
and place the coin envelopes in a box
That's my understanding, that it's a box so that they can now air dry, that the tubes can now air dry.
and place
French
the box
toast,
up on a metal
paper plate.
shelf up on the wall?
No dishes.
Well, this is my general understanding. I've never seen the actual room.
Let's talk about the qualities of DNA. Now, we've got everything drying up in the tubes, and assume it's dried overnight.
Okay?
Okay? Have you seen photographs of what DNA looks like, powerful microscopic photographs?
Well, there are, yes, they're very, very powerful microscopes. You can see the motion of DNA, for example.
Now, can DNA fly?
I don't think so.
I mean, there are no scientific studies that have shown that, are there?
No, I don't think it has wings.
How about if it's from a bird? Can it fly?
I don't think that makes any difference.
Does the DNA of an athletic person that's in a stain have any athletic prowess more than a dead person?
Sustained.
I'm-
Sustained. Sustained. Curious to disregard the tenor of that question. Proceed.
Are you aware of any scientific studies that show the DNA can come to life at night?
Objection.
Sustained.
Is it possible for the samples to have been cross-contaminated up on the shelf, in the box, in the coin envelopes, in those tubes?
Again, I would answer that the substrate controls provide the monitor to ensure that that didn't occur.
Now, I believe you discussed, and I'm getting close to the end here, Mr. Sims, I believe you discussed, I think you, in discussing some of your sample processing, you mentioned you bleach your rulers. Is that right?
Yes.
And I think you also said, what do you wipe your tools with when you're doing evidence processing?
I do three things. I do a water wash down under the tap. Then I wipe it with a chem wipe. Then I do an ethanol rinse and wipe that off. And then finally I flame them over a Bunsen burner flame, a very hot flame.
And what kind of tools are we talking about?
Generally, that would be a pair of scissors, small scissors, and a forceps, or like tweezers.
Flaming your tools?
No.
Let's talk about not flaming your tools and inject substrate controls into that process. What safeguard do the existence or the availability of substrate controls to type all the way through the process, what impact do they have on detecting cross-contamination if it occurs?
Well, again, they're an important safeguard because if one were to cut the stain, wipe the scissors, for example, then those scissors would next see a substrate control. And again, that substrate control is very vulnerable. If anything's going to get contaminated, it's the substrate control.
Why is that?
Because it should have no DNA to begin with. I mean, it could. You could have a substrate control that had DNA to begin with, but assuming there's no DNA to begin with, whatever you put down is now its DNA. So in other words, whatever type now shows up could be it's become that type.
Okay, and let's stay on the same topic and not talk about flaming tools, but talk about just wiping tools with water.
Okay?
You have a three-step wiping process. If one were to just wipe with water and systematically alternate between an evidence stain and a substrate control, what safeguard does that substrate control provide in ensuring that no cross-contamination has occurred?
Again, it should provide a safeguard in that it should then monitor for any contamination.
And if the substrate controls test clean, as they did in this case, what assurance or what do you conclude from the possibility or that the cross-contamination did not occur in this case?
Again, it's another piece of evidence that you're not contaminating those samples.
Okay, Mr. Sims, next to the last subject here, in your conventional serology expertise, have you testified about the genetic marker EAP?
Yes, I have.
And how many times?
I couldn't give a number on EAP in particular, but it was a commonly used enzyme in the days that I did conventional serology.
And are you familiar with the scientific literature on that subject?
Yes, I am. I used to be much more familiar with it than I am now, but yes.
If you could describe the marker EAP and what a forensic scientist should be aware of in that context, what would be your brief statement of the use of EAP?
Well, I think one has to be very careful in interpreting EAP band patterns. It's subject to certain. It's an unusual marker in that there are certain intensities as well as band positional things that we have to take into account. I think Mr. Matheson probably went into that in great detail, but it's unusual in that the intensities are an important part of the interpretation and the relative instabilities of certain bands.
Okay, have you reviewed Mr. Matheson's records on this subject?
I have reviewed some of his records, yes.
And do you have those records with you?
Yes, I do.
Could I see them?
Mr. Jack, you want to take a look?
Could we have these items marked as exhibit next in order, Your Honor?
All right, People's 273.
See, there is actually two items, Your Honor. I'll describe them. Mr. Matheson's analyzed evidence report dated October 18th. And I'll count the pages.
All right, is anything being put in that wasn't previously put in when Mr. Matheson testified?
No,
just-
they're the same items.
Go make French toast. It's delicious.
We can refer to them.
So
Maybe
good.
Mr. Scheck can confirm they're the same items. I don't have to mark them there. Maybe we can refer to those
If
prior.
it's already marked.
It is. I just hadn't shown the exact exhibits to Mr. Sims.
I would prefer that we use the exhibits that were previously introduced through the prior witness
Previously
for
marked.
foundational matters.
One of the exhibits is an electrophoretic marked 224A.
All right, then you're withdrawing 273 at this point.
Yes, I am, Your Honor.
Fine.
And we're going to have to mark Mr. Matheson's report because it's more complete than the exhibit that was marked, Your Honor. Count the pages.
All right, so we can keep them straight. Why don't we make the additional report an addenda to the original
Okay.
exhibit? Ms. Martinez, you have the designation of that report?
This item is 23 pages, Your Honor. You want me to go ahead, Your Honor?
Now, People's 218.
All right, 218, then the additional report will be 218A, the complete, more complete report.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Sure.
Mr. Sims, have you reviewed Mr. Matheson's analyzed evidence report, now specifically with respect to items 84A and B, some typing that Mr. Sims did on some fingernail kits?
That Mr. Matheson
I
did?
mean, Mr. Matheson, I'm sorry.
Yes.
Okay. And have you reviewed the electrophoretic, which is a picture of the gel that he ran those on?
Yes.
Okay.
You're referring to People's 223A.
Want to give
The electrophoretic
224A.
224A. Got it. Thank you.
Mr. Sims, I want to give you a hypothetical. I'm going to put the nail board up there, Your Honor. Mr. Sims, why don't I start with my hypothetical, and I'm going to, when the board is up there, I'm going to ask you to look at the board, okay?
Okay.
Oh, here we have it.
Yes, I'm going to direct the photographers not to take any photographs of this board. Thank you. Proceed.
Mr. Sims, have you had a chance to study the pictures along the bottom of that board? You've already described how those are your photographs, the top 5 photographs. Have you had a chance to see the 3 along the bottom of Nicole Brown?
No, I just saw him for the first time the other day.
Have you had an adequate chance to look at them?
I'd like a moment.
Okay, sure.
Poor guy.
Could we raise it a little bit, Your Honor? It's a little bit low for the jurors
I'm
on the end.
1,000% grateful that we don't have to see it. I'm grateful that the judge is like, nah, no cameras. Thank you, Judge Ito. I mean, we still see it in our brains. Hey,
Okay, Mr.
jury.
Sims, you've had a chance to
Jury.
look at Nicole Brown's hands.
Hey, jury. In case you haven't remembered, it's a murder trial. She was murdered.
And the blood on them, have you?
Yes.
All right, this is People's Exhibit, which, I forget which one this is. Mr. Sims, could you tell me what the evidence tag says there on the corner here?
220.
220, thank you.
You've had a chance to look at those 3 photos, Mr. Sims?
Yes.
I'm going to ask you a question, a hypothetical question, and I'd like you to consider the following things before I ask you the question, okay? You've considered the photographs, the 3 photographs of Nicole Brown's body and hands on 220, right?
Okay.
Also, I'd like you to consider the fact that you observed no tissue in the nail scrapings for when you saw them and you processed them for PCR typing in this case, okay?
Okay.
I'd like you to consider that your PCR results were consistent with the type of Nicole Brown.
Okay.
Okay. I'd like you to consider that Cellmark's PCR results were consistent with the types of Nicole Brown.
Okay.
I'd like you to consider that the 3 separate samples which were typed by you and Cellmark all produced consistent results. Okay?
Okay.
I'd like you to consider the sensitivity differences between the PCR typing method and the conventional serology marker typing for EAP. Okay?
Okay.
I'd like you to consider that Greg Matheson saw no tissue when he sampled from the nail scrapings before you.
With objection, foundation.
Sustain, as to that last point.
Your Honor, there is testimony.
Sustaining the objection to that point.
Could we approach? If Greg Matheson saw no tissue in the nail scrapings that he
Same ruling.
sampled. Excuse me, Your Honor?
Same ruling, I'm sustaining the objection to that aspect. Continue.
Could we search the trans?
Proceed, counsel.
If Greg Matheson saw no tissue,
Same question, same objection, same ruling.
if Greg Matheson only sampled blood when he sampled the nail scraping kits, okay?
Okay.
And
Still foundation.
Overruled.
And finally, what you know about the EAP marker and specifically the BA pattern. Okay, we have all those things that I want you to consider.
Okay.
Okay, the question is, would you, as a forensic serologist, exclude Nicole Brown as the source of the blood under her fingernails and on her fingernail based on Greg Matheson's report and the electrophoretic that you reviewed?
Objection, foundation as to blood. Source of what blood?
I think the question is clear to the jury. Overruled.
Given all those considerations, my answer would be no.
Okay. Mr. Matheson, are you part of some conspiracy to frame the defendant in this case?
Well, my name is Sims, and
I mean
no, I'm
Sims,
not
I'm
part of
sorry.
the conspiracy.
So you are conspiring, huh? Okay, Mr. Sims, you're not, okay?
We'll stipulate to that, so.
Okay, thank you. No further questions.
All right, Mr. Scheck, do you want to begin now?
Well, Your Honor, we have some things that we have to show.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we'll take a brief break to reorganize our exhibits here, so I'll ask you to step back into the jury room, please, and this should only take about 5 or 10 minutes.
That was outstandingly fair question. That's what they're saying. It's what they're trying to say to us.
Break for the noon hour at this time. With regards to the jurors, please remember all of my admonitions to you. Don't discuss the case amongst yourselves. Don't form any opinions about the case. Don't conduct any deliberations until the matter has been submitted to you. And do not allow anybody to communicate with you with regard to the case. And as far as the jury is concerned, we'll stand in recess until 1 o'clock. All right, have a nice lunch.
That's because we're...
Sorry, Your Honor.
Now, as an expert in crime laboratory procedures, you would agree, would you not, that there are certain factors which can create a risk of cross-contamination when handling forensic samples in a laboratory,
Yes.
and that there are certain methods and precautions that ought to be followed to prevent cross-contamination.
Yes.
Your Honor, I'd like to, where are the numbers on this? a series of slides that I'd like to display to the jury and the witness. Should we call them collectively 1159, and then I'll do 1159 A, B, and C. Could we show 1159A? I guess this is the departure point for our discussion, cross-contamination factors. Could we now see 1159B? Mr. Sims, would you not agree that degradation of a crime scene specimen is an important factor to consider with respect to the issue of cross-contamination?
Well, degradation by itself is a factor in that if there's very little DNA there, one would have to be more worried about what could happen to that particular sample. That's true.
And in this particular slide, in the box, red box number 1, I'd ask you to regard that as a blood swatch containing the DNA of person number 1, and then the arrow indicates a process of degradation where the biological material that would show up on a DNA typing test has been degraded to the point where it's not detectable.
So it's no longer detectable.
No longer detectable.
Okay?
All right. And a swatch such as the one on the right-hand side where the biological material has been degraded to the point where it is no longer detectable is the kind of sample that one should take great care in handling in a forensic laboratory.
Yes.
Because when you have a degraded sample like that, the dangers and the risk of cross-contamination increases.
Yes.
Thank you. Could we have 259B?
C.
C. Thank you. C. Okay. Now, another consideration in the question of cross-contamination is trying to separate those samples that have high DNA content from those that have low DNA content.
That's true. That is a consideration.
Because when one is handling samples that have a high DNA content, and there's an inadvertent transfer to samples that have a low DNA content, cross-contamination can occur by accident.
Yes, that is a concern. In other words, that the high one could contaminate the low one.
Right. And so, as much as you can, you would want to, in your practice in crime laboratory, separate out those samples that have high DNA content from low DNA content when you're handling them.
Yeah, well, especially when you're doing the DNA extraction. That's where we are most concerned with that in our laboratory.
Well, when you're handling the samples when they're wet.
What kind of sample would that
Let's
be?
watch this.
When blood swatches are wet, and now you're talking about a swatch that has a lot of DNA on it that's wet, and a swatch that has a lot less DNA and that's also wet.
Let's make it in this hypothetical wet or somewhat drier.
Well, I think at some point you have to realize that it's like taking universal precautions. Sort of like when a hospital looks at blood samples, they assume every sample has AIDS. That's what's called universal precautions. And so you have to take what I would consider universal precautions, whether you've got a swatch that has high or low, because you don't know. You don't know the content.
This is the effort to separate samples that have high DNA content from low DNA content is a precaution you try to follow in your laboratory.
Yes, but that's particularly in our laboratory when we're talking about DNA extraction. That's the main point there, because that's when you turn this into a liquid sample.
When you are actually handling and examining samples, don't you try to take reasonable care to divide up those samples that have high DNA content from low DNA content?
Vague as to handling and sampling and
No.
compound, John?
Compound. Examining.
Well, for example, when I look at a garment that I might take a blood stain from, that blood stain may be a high-level blood stain, but then I would also, right next to it on the same garment, have a substrate control area that would be considered a low level. So when you're talking about examining items, I see that it's different than when you're talking about extracting DNA. Those are two separate issues to me.
when you would agree, so examining is when you're just looking at them.
Yes.
Then you get to the point where you might actually cut a sample,
Yes.
such as a glove,
Yes.
such as a swatch.
Yes.
Would you not agree at the point where you cut a sample that you should take precautions to separate items that have high DNA content and low DNA content?
Yes, at that level, I would agree with that. And what I tend to do is to work on one item at a time so that they're separated in that manner.
And as you indicated, that when you then move from the point of cutting the samples to the point of processing or analyzing them, you also want to take special concern to separate samples that have high DNA content from those that have low DNA content.
Yes.
You're familiar with something called the Amplotype User Guide.
Yes, I am.
What is the Amplotype User Guide?
The Amplotype user guide is provided by the company that actually makes the PCR kits that are used in forensic science, and that user guide is usually provided to the students who take the course.
This is like a basic fundamental text on how to use, in this instance, PCR-based techniques.
Yes.
Although the discussion that we're having about separating samples of high and low content and degradation would apply to RFLP testing as well as PCR testing.
Well, it is more of a concern in PCR testing, I would say that, but yes, it's always a concern.
Are you saying that it's not a concern that you could get genomic DNA cross-contamination for purposes of RFLP testing?
Objection argumentative misstates his testimony.
Sustained.
Now, in that Amplotype guide, is there not, at the very beginning of it, a section indicating special precautions? Recall that?
Yes, I do.
And in that special precautions, does not the kit indicate that performing DNA extractions from samples containing,
Calls for hearsay, Your Honor.
Sustained.
all right, do you recall any specific guidance given in the Amplotype User Guide with respect to separating samples containing high DNA content and low DNA content when performing extractions?
Yes, I do.
What does it say?
Objection. Calls for hearsay.
Sustained. Want to just add a few foundational questions here?
Well, is this the precautions listed in the Amplotype User Guide be ones that you would rely upon as a forensic DNA analyst?
Well, I'd be careful about saying everything that's in there, but the bulk of that material, by all means.
Why don't just
Why don't you show him the specific pages that you're talking about?
Yeah, we'll get it. Why don't you take a look at section 2.2.2 on page 2 of the guide?
Yes.
All right. Would you rely, and I'm calling your attention to paragraph 1, and call your attention to the, I think it's just about the last sentence there that begins, perform DNA extractions from samples. Is that a precaution that you would rely upon that's in the user guide?
Yes.
All right. And that precaution states that that one should perform DNA extraction from samples containing high levels of DNA, for example, whole blood, separately from samples containing a low-level DNA, single hairs, small blood stains, etc., to minimize the potential for sample-to-sample contamination.
Yes, I agree with that.
And you agree with that, do you
Yes,
not?
I do.
And when we're talking here about extraction, we're talking about that stage in the process where you take the little cuttings and you put them into these test tubes,
Well, I think at this point they're saying you've already got it in the test tube.
all right, when you pour the reagents in,
Yes.
during that period of the analysis.
Yes.
Now, can we turn to D?
Oh.
Now, you have samples from different crime scenes.
Okay.
Would you take special care when examining the samples to try to examine them separately?
Well, I don't see how one could examine those samples, you'd have to do it separately. There are 3 different locations that I'm seeing. I see a little blue car and I see 2 little houses like Monopoly.
There are limitations to computer clip art, Mr. Sims.
But there
Why
are...
don't you assume the blue car white, and
Okay.
assume one of those houses looks like Bundy and the other one looks like Rockingham.
Okay.
All right? Now, wouldn't you agree that in terms of these little swatches that you get from different scenes, that just even in examining them, it would be good laboratory practice to examine them separately?
Yes, one at a time.
And wouldn't it be good laboratory practice when cutting these swatches to separate the swatches that you get from different scenes?
I think that again goes more to the extraction, perhaps. That's what I did in this case, as much as possible. Is I kept the Bronco samples by themselves. I kept the Bundy stuff by itself. I kept the Rockingham stuff by itself. The only time I violated that was the very first set of extractions when there was one Bundy drop and I think one Rockingham drop. But I think as long as you're doing them one at a time when you're cutting them and then putting that sample away and making sure you have a clean surface, I think that's okay.
Right. Well, we'll get to what you do in cutting them one at a time and keeping clean surfaces. But just as a general practice, what you tried to do as much as possible, even at the stage when you got the samples, was process the samples from the different scenes each separately.
Yes.
And when samples first come into a crime laboratory and you're, let's say, cutting swatches, it would be good practice to make sure that you cut the swatches from one scene separately from those of another scene.
Well, again, I think as long as you work on them one at a time, that's okay. I don't think it's bad practice necessarily to look at two swatches in a row, as long as you clean up where you're working and you clean up your tools between each sample.
We'll talk about cleaning and changing gloves and the rest of it. But let's just talk as a general practice. You try to keep the samples from different scenes separate.
In general, yes.
Because now let's assume that one set of samples from one scene are severely degraded and another set of samples from another scene are not.
Okay.
Wouldn't it heighten the risk of cross-contamination if you sampled those swatches from different scenes in the same time and in the same location?
Insufficient basis for that question, improper hypothetical cause for speculation, it's argumentative.
Would it heighten it under
Heighten
that?
the risk of
under that,
cross-contamination? Yes, under that hypothetical.
under that hypothetical, yes.
Your Honor, this is a point where I have to approach to clarify
What's the court
something.
reporter, please? Mr. Shea, you may proceed.
Mr. Sims, if you had one set of samples, blood swatches, that were collected from blood stains that came from inside a house on a clean wood surface,
Okay.
and they were collected between an hour and a half and 2 hours before the time that you began handling the swatches, examining and handling the swatches, okay?
Okay, wait, they were collected about 2 hours before.
Before you began handling and manipulating the wet blood swatches, okay?
Back at the laboratory?
Back at the laboratory.
Okay.
Then you had another set of samples that had been collected seven hours before you got to the laboratory. All right?
Okay.
That came off concrete substrates.
Okay.
It's a possibility of exposure to soil and bacteria
Okay.
that were packaged in plastic bags,
Okay.
left in those plastic bags for 7 hours.
Okay.
Would you agree that, number one, the samples that came from those plastic bags that were collected 7 hours earlier, there's a good chance that they would be more degraded than the swatches that had been collected 3 hours earlier from inside a home?
Objection, cause for speculation, good chances, somewhat vague, Your Honor.
Sustained.
So in your opinion, as a criminalist, would you regard, one, the set of swatches that came off the substrates put in the plastic bags, collected 7 hours earlier, would you expect those to be more degraded than the samples that had been collected only 3 hours before you handled them that came off a clean wooden floor?
Objection, it's incomplete about the packaging of those samples, Your Honor.
And those samples that came off the clean wooden floor have been put into plastic bags. Those were about at an hour and a half in that plastic bag for about an hour, hour and a half.
Okay, so as part of the hypothetical, the floor is very clean, the
Yep.
sidewalk is very dirty,
Well, let's just say dirty.
okay? But the floor is very clean.
Yeah.
Okay, and then the question is, would I expect the ones on the sidewalk that have been packaged to be degraded?
Ones in the sidewalk that had been put in plastic bags, right,
Okay,
for 7 hours
okay,
before you examine them,
Okay.
versus the ones that came off the clean floor that had been in the plastic bag for only an hour and a half.
okay, yes, I think you would expect the ones from the sidewalk to be more degraded.
Let's turn to, before we do. And
Yeah, but
it would
yeah,
be a good precaution.
it doesn't mean he's not going to get the same results from them. That doesn't mean he's still gonna, they're still gonna know this came from Nicole, this came from Ron. Just because they were more degraded doesn't mean they're useless.
In the laboratory, those samples that I've described, ones in the plastic bags for 7 hours off the dirtier substrate, ones in a plastic bag for an hour, hour and a half off the clean substrate, both came from different scenes. It would be good laboratory practice not to examine and cut those in the same time, in the same place.
Objection, same time and same place as compound, it's also vague.
At the same time.
The same time.
I'll take it
vague.
one at a time. At the same, in the same,
Time is vague, Your Honor.
Wait, you guys are talking at the same time as well. Why don't you rephrase the question? It is vague as to when you say handle, I mean, do we mean
all right?
process them all at the same time, separately, how?
If you were to take those two sets of samples that we've discussed, all right,
Okay,
and take them out of plastic bags
okay,
without regard to whether you handled one from one scene before or after handling one from the other, would that be a good laboratory practice that, withdrawn? If you handle them one from one scene, taking them out of the plastic bags, putting them in test tubes, right?
okay,
Then you took another one from another scene, took it out of the plastic bag, put it in a test tube, all right?
okay,
During the same period of time, on the same work surface, without changing paper, without changing gloves, would that be a sound laboratory practice in your opinion?
Objection, during the same period of time as vague, Your Honor.
Oh, I think you understand the question.
I'm not sure I do, Your Honor,
Well,
I'm
why don't
sorry.
you ask for
Can
clarification?
you just rephrase that one, or just repeat the
All right,
question?
let's take sample number one from the 7-hour scene.
Okay,
It's in a plastic bag, swatches in a plastic bag.
okay,
You're taking these out of a plastic bag, you have a piece of paper on the table.
okay,
You're wearing gloves,
okay,
plastic gloves. You take a test tube, you stick it into that plastic bag, and get the wet swatches by manipulation into the test tube.
okay,
That's the process you use.
okay,
You take that from crime scene number one that has the swatches that have been in the plastic bags for 7 hours.
okay,
Then, without changing gloves, without changing the paper below, you move to the plastic bag containing the samples from the second scene.
okay,
Use the same method of taking the test tube, going into the plastic bag, right?
okay,
Manipulating it so you get the swatch out. Then with those same gloves, right?
okay,
Taking the test tube and packaging it into a coin envelope.
okay. I understand that.
One second. Sorry. Why don't you just, to terms of my hypothetical, why don't you just assume that you handled the swatches that were collected an hour and a half before you got to the laboratory first, and then the other samples second.
So you did them as two separate sets, is that what you're saying?
You did plastic bag number 1, you handled from this, that was the one that had contained the swatches an hour and a half old,
Okay,
right? Plastic bag number 2 came from the samples that were 7 hours in the plastic bag from the dirty surfaces.
okay. So as I understand this now, somebody's taking what I would call a culture tube. Is that the right size?
The test tube.
Test tube. They're sticking that tube into a plastic envelope to capture the swatch into that tube,
Wet swatch.
a wet swatch. I would say one should change gloves between those two sets, yes.
Let's say you didn't change gloves.
Well, the other thing about blood is it's very visible, and one may look at the gloves and see whether or not there was any visible contamination that way.
If you didn't change gloves, are you saying, Mr. Sims, that that's the kind of laboratory practice that you would engage in?
No.
Now let's talk about let's turn to I'd like to go actually to, I think it's F. The one that's F. Yes. Now, samples that come from a victim and samples that come from a suspect. Assume they're blood swatches.
Okay?
You should handle those separately.
Separately.
Bag separately from what?
Should you examine those separately?
Same objection, Your Honor.
Why don't you clarify that, Mr. Shea?
Let's try this.
Now I feel bad. When I made pizzas at Big Dog, I put the cheese on and the pepperonis on with the same gloves. I just did.
Would you agree that items of evidence collected from suspects should be handled separately from evidence samples?
Yes.
Because this practice guards against sample mix-up and cross-transfer.
Yes.
You have a protocol in your laboratory.
Yes, we do.
It's a detailed protocol.
Yes, it is.
Are you familiar with section 6.3 of your protocol?
I don't know the protocol by number, but if you read it to me, I'll let you know, or you show it to me.
Section 6.3 of your protocol concerns the examination of samples.
Yes, it does.
We're just talking now about looking at them and examining them.
Yes.
We're not talking at this stage about cutting them.
Yes.
We're not talking at this stage about packaging and handling them.
Well, no, wait, we have to back up. When we're talking about examining them, there may be some cutting. I'm sorry, I
Okay.
agreed with you too quickly on that one.
Sorry.
Yes, we are talking about having the evidence out there and sampling it.
And this section of your own protocol is something you rely on,
Yes, it is.
something you think is a good idea.
Yes, I do.
And in your protocol, does it not state that in general, the examiner should examine only one item of evidence at a time,
Yes,
marking the evidence with a unique identifier,
yes,
returning it to its container before opening another item,
yes,
and, in particular, items of evidence collected from suspects should be examined separately from victim samples.
yes,
And that's a practice that your protocol indicates will guard against sample mix-up and cross-transfer.
yes,
And you think that's an important precaution to take against cross-contamination, don't you?
cross-contamination and sample mix-up, yes,
And mix-up of samples.
yes,
So, in terms of this logo, which we don't intend to have, clip art's limited, and this is not supposed to look like men's room and women's rooms and logos. But You agree with this principle that one should separate suspect victim samples?
Yes.
Now, let's turn to E. Now, wouldn't you agree that of extraordinary importance is the need to handle reference samples, be it from a suspect or victims, separately from evidence samples?
Objection, handle and separately or vague, Your Honor?
Rephrase.
Just in terms of, would you try to keep separate the taking of any blood from a reference sample in terms of the time and place from the examination, cutting, or handling of an evidence sample?
By that, do you mean, for example, preparing a swatch of the reference stain or
Yes.
the reference sample, that sort of thing? Yes.
That is a cardinal rule, isn't it?
Well, I don't know if it's a cardinal rule, but it is an important concept, yes.
That's in your protocol.
It may be the exact wording I'm not sure of, but again, I think it's important.
Are you familiar, did I give you the Ampletype guide?
Yes, I have it here.
All right. Why don't you again look at section 2.2.2, special precautions.
Okay?
Ask you to look at sentence 1,
Okay?
starting with "it is important."
Okay?
Do you rely on that section?
Objections, vague, rely on for what reason?
Oh, well, obviously for the application of this process.
2.2.2 on page 2.
Yes.
I do agree with and I do practice that the DNA extraction will be separated in time from the reference samples against the evidence samples, but the PCR setup of evidence samples, it says, should be performed at a separate time from the DNA extraction and PCR setup of reference samples. I don't follow that. Usually what I do is I put the evidence samples first in a set that I'm going to do the PCR analysis on, and then I get to the the reference samples last along the stream, so that you don't start upstream with the reference samples. Instead, they're downstream from that process. But I do extract them separately. Yes, I agree with that part of it.
All right, let's start with this. So you would agree that it is important that DNA extraction of evidence samples be performed at a separate time from DNA extraction of reference samples.
Yes.
And this precaution will help prevent potential cross-contamination between evidence samples and reference samples.
I agree with that.
Now, you're familiar with the California Association of Crime Lab Directors open proficiency tests in 1988 and 89.
I have some familiarity with them, yes.
And you have studied the factors that led to false positives by different DNA laboratories that participated in that open proficiency test.
Objections, irrelevant, also hearsay?
Sustained.
Are you aware? Have you familiar with that going into the content yet? Have you familiarized yourself with the circumstances surrounding false positives obtained by the Cellmark laboratory?
Absolutely irrelevant.
Sustained.
All right. With respect to false positives arising from RFLP testing, when a laboratory is handling at the same time reference samples from a suspect and evidence samples. Are you aware of false positives ever arising in that context?
In other words, am I aware of any documented example of that?
Yeah.
When you were that specific, I couldn't recall that. I am aware of sample mix-ups, but I wasn't sure of the actual what got mixed up with what.
Well, before you came in here to testify, Mr. Sims, you were watching this proceeding on television.
Some of it, yes.
When Dr. Cotton was testifying, weren't you upstairs in the prosecutor's office watching television in terms of her testimony?
I actually spent very little time up there watching television.
Where did you watch it?
I watched some of it in my hotel room, and I watched a little bit of it when I was upstairs, but most of the time that I'm upstairs, I'm not watching the television.
Did you watch her testimony?
Some of it,
Watch cross-examination?
some of it,
Talk about it with the prosecutors?
a little bit.
In your reading in terms of forensic DNA testing, have you read literature concerning false positives on the CACLD tests?
Objection. It's irrelevant. Calls for hearsay. 721 of the Evidence Code, Your Honor.
Sustained.
Were the false positives in the CACLD tests a matter of concern to people in the forensic DNA community?
Objection. It's irrelevant. Calls for hearsay. 721 of the Evidence Code. Assumes facts, not an
I'm only asking if it was a matter of concern.
It assumes that he knows it. I'm sorry.
Yes,
You recall when those results were announced?
yes, I do, roughly the date, the time.
And you recall that you mentioned Dr. Blake.
Yes,
He participated in those tests.
yes, he did.
He got a false positive in the first round, too.
I believe it was a false positive, although it may have been a false negative. I'm not sure, but he did have a problem on one sample.
And
I
he was
recall.
using PCR.
That's correct.
And Selmark was using RFLP.
Selmark, my understanding, was using RFLP. Dr. Blake was using PCR DQ alpha in a different dot plot format than is used now.
Did you hear Dr. Cotton's testimony with respect to how the false positives arose in the CACLD tests?
You know, I think I missed that part.
You did?
I don't recall hearing all that.
In your review of the literature with respect to the CACLD open proficiency tests, did you become aware of a false positive arising when samples, evidence samples were handled?
Objection. Improper foundation. 721. It's hearsay.
Sustained.
With respect to handling reference samples, at the same time, in the same area as evidence samples, all right?
Okay.
Isn't that a particularly dangerous practice because the reference sample has a high concentration of DNA in the whole blood?
Objection. It's compound, same time and area. It's vague, same time and area. Particularly dangerous practices.
I think he's already conceded that.
Right, overruled.
It's also argumentative.
Overruled.
Now, again, could you, when you describe the same, is it what, the same time and the same place? Is that what
Yeah.
you're saying?
You discussed before, remember you saying, pouring out a reference sample and making a card in the
Yes,
same area that one is then handling reference samples.
You mean that one is then handling evidence samples?
That's right, evidence.
Yes, I think that would not be a good idea.
And one of the reasons it's not a good idea is that the reference sample contains a high concentration of DNA in the whole blood.
That's correct.
And a very small amount of blood, talking microliter,
Yes.
that is transferred to an evidence specimen can cause a cross-contamination.
That's true.
A microliter of blood contains how many nanograms? High molecular weight DNA, would you estimate?
Yes, that would be about 20 nanograms, something like that, per microliter, because it's about 20 microliter, I'm sorry, about 20 micrograms per mil, so you're taking it down. That sounds right, about 20 nanograms per microliter
Could be
of
more.
whole blood. It could be more. Some people have more, some people have less.
And Did you hear Dr. Cotton's testimony with respect to how much DNA was in the evidence lane of item 52 in her RFLP test?
Objection, calls for hearsay.
Sustain.
All right. Are you aware of how much DNA was in the reference lane for 52 in the Cellmark RFLP test?
Objection still calls for hearsay, no foundation, calls for speculation.
It's also irrelevant. Sustain.
Relevant?
It's already in the record, Counsel.
Well, that's the point.
You want to pose it as a hypothetical of a particular
Okay.
nanogram.
Okay. If there were thank you. It's a long day. If there's cross-contamination of microliter particle of blood to a swatch, that could cause as much as 20 nanograms, 25 nanograms of high molecular weight DNA to be on a swatch.
Yes.
And you can get RFLP results from as little as 25 nanograms.
On a good day, yes.
Now, and of course, you can get PCR results on how much DNA?
In our laboratory, the limit we would test would be down in the, what we would call 300 picograms, which is 0.3 nanograms.
Let's talk small here. A nanogram is a billionth of a gram.
That's correct.
So what's a picogram?
That's a trillionth of a gram.
Can you see it with the naked eye?
You wouldn't see the DNA, no.
Could you see the amount of blood that it would take to, from which one could get, what did you say, how many picograms could you do?
300 picograms?
300 picograms.
Well, I think, make it a little clearer, from a blood stain that's about a millimeter by a millimeter, you could get about 2 nanograms. So that's 2,000 picograms. So I think that gives you an idea of how small we're talking about.
Well, is that something that you would suspect?
Excuse me, Mr. Scheck, I don't think Mr. Sims was finished answering.
Oh, were you finished? I'm sorry.
I guess I'm done.
Oh, you finished?
I lost the train anyway, so go
Well,
ahead.
let's get back on the train. The size of, you said 300 picograms?
Yes.
The size of a particle of blood that could create, from which you could extract 300 picograms of DNA, would that be visible to the naked eye?
I think it would be visible, but it would be a speck. I mean, it's very small.
Now, the amount that, of speck of blood that would give you 2 nanograms, it's pretty small too.
Well, now again, that's about a millimeter by a millimeter, and that's pretty small, but it's visible, very visible.
Now, let's see, I guess it's, let's turn to G. Another precaution that one takes to prevent cross-contamination is not to do PCR processing on multiple samples at the same time.
Objection, PCR processing is vague, Your Honor.
Sustain.
All right. In the PCR, let's talk about the PCR process a little bit.
Okay?
One stage, you would literally cut the sample, correct?
Yes.
What's the next stage? Would you call that part of the extraction process?
No, that would be part of the sampling.
Sampling process. What's the next process?
The next process, once you've got it in the tube, is to go through the actual extraction of the DNA.
All right, and you do that how?
Well, in our laboratory, we do that by a procedure that involves placing or adding to that swatch, that stain, a solution that has a soap, a detergent actually in it, and an enzyme that chews up the protein. And that releases the DNA, and then that excess protein is removed by organic reagents, and then we do a purification step through a ultracentrifugation through a membrane.
But just visualizing it then, you take a piece of that extract, you put it in one of these little microfuge tubes,
You take a piece of that swatch.
Swatch.
Yes, and you
Put it in the
that
microfuge tubes,
That's
and then you
first.
add all those things you were just talking about into that tube.
That's correct.
All right? And so you create a whole series of test tubes with these swatches.
That's correct.
And some of these tubes are the ones that you were talking about before that you were calling reagent blanks.
Yes, you would include reagent blanks in there.
And that would be just a tube that had just the ingredients but no swatches.
That's correct.
And when you're talking about some of those substrate controls, those would be those little tubes, but they would be the substrate control swatches, not the evidence specimen swatches.
That's correct. They would be in there too.
Right. And you would also, you mentioned something what you call a quality control, correct?
Yes, in our laboratory we run that.
And that's another swatch,
Yes.
and you cut that swatch out and you put it in another one of those little tubes.
Yes.
And then after you do what you call the extraction process, putting the swatches in the tubes and adding the ingredients, what's the next stage?
Well, then after you've got that process, you end up with a solution that has just the DNA. And so then the next stage would be the evaluation of the DNA as far as quality and quantity.
That's called the slot blot?
Yes, for the quantity, that's the slot blot.
All right. Quantity is what they call a SWOT blot analysis.
Slot blot
SWOT
analysis, yes.
Did I say SWOT?
Yes.
SWOT blot analysis. You do that for all the tubes.
If you go that route, sometimes we use a yield gel for
All right.
quantitation.
Or sometimes we've had a discussion of something called a yield gel, right?
Yes,
And that's a method by which you get an assessment of the total amount of DNA in the sample.
that's correct.
Well,
And
sorry.
also the quality of the DNA, whether it's degraded or not.
All right. And just so we understand what a yield gel tells you the total amount of DNA, but it doesn't tell you whether that DNA is bacterial or human.
That's correct, unless you do another procedure where you blot that gel and
Right.
test it.
And another procedure one can perform after the yield gel is what you call a southern transfer.
That's correct.
And that's literally one of those like the RFLP gels or those little agarose, it's a little agarose gel.
Yes,
And you get little bands, just like we saw in the RFLP.
yes,
And those little bands, depending on how intense they are, give you some understanding of how much human DNA as opposed to bacterial DNA you have.
yes.
All right? Now, if you're doing a slot blot and you're doing 20, you try to withdraw. Each stage of this procedure, whatever you're doing, you're going to do to all those different tubes.
Yes.
After you do the slot blot or the yield gel or the southern transfer to that stage, what's the next stage?
Well, then you would move into the typing stage, and that would be, for example, the RFLP setup, which is the restriction, or if you did PCR, that would be the amplification of the DNA.
Right. And if it were PCR, the amplification of DNA, you take those test tubes and you stick it into that thermocycler machine.
Thermocycler, yes,
That's what amplifies up, does what they call the molecular xeroxing of the DNA.
that's correct.
And if you were doing X number of tubes to the extraction, the slot blot, then the next thing when you did the amplification, you would take it and do it with the same number of tubes, right?
Yes, I mean, assuming you're going to do that with all the tubes, right? I mean, in
Right.
other words, you're treating them as a group, yes.
And when you amplify them up, sometimes that's referred to as amplification run.
Yes,
Now, in terms of this process, is it a good precaution to limit the quantity of samples you do in a single run to a manageable number?
Good precaution.
All right. How many of these samples did you do at one time the most in this case?
I have that information, if I can have 1 second to look it up.
Mr. Shepp will be taking a break at 2:30.
Thank you.
The greatest number of samples that I analyzed at one time, and this would include the stains and the substrate controls, plus a QC sample and an extraction blank. These were all from the Bronco, and I believe the number is 21.
When was that?
That, I can tell you, I think if you look at on page 34 of my notes. Yes, that was on September 21st, 1994,
What page is it?
page 34.
You're familiar with the Amplotype user guide recommendation in terms of samples?
Yes, I don't know the exact number in there, but I think they do mention a number.
15?
15 sounds close to the right, but you have to recall that when you do this kind of test, you're really limited to the amplification of about 16 samples. Actually, not the amplification, but the typing, you're limited to about 16 at a time. So that might be the number that they're discussing, because you'd have to include a positive and negative control.
Well, including us.
Well, yes, 15 sounds funny to me, but it might be correct.
Yeah, I'll get a page.
Mr. Sims, can you tell us? What page?
Page 4. Number 14.
Is that two? Oh, okay. Limit the should I?
Yeah, read it to yourself, see if you,
See if that refreshes your
does that
recollection.
refresh your recollection?
Yes, it does.
All right, the number's 15.
Yes, it says approximately 15.
Now, would you agree that when performing all the operations that we talked about in terms of processing the samples, it's important not to rush?
I agree with that.
These are delicate procedures.
Yes.
That the opening of a tube, popping of a tube and the creation of an aerosol has been known to cause cross-contamination in this process.
Objection is argumentative. No
Sustain.
foundation.
Do you know if the popping open of a tube can create an aerosol which creates cross-contamination in this process?
Now this
Objection. Popping is vague.
this would be a tube of DNA.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm aware of that, and that's why we always spin our tubes down so that that won't create that aerosol problem. So we always spin a tube down before we pop it open.
You have to be careful with exactly how you touch the tops of these tubes.
Well, I am careful about that. Yes,
One has to be, an analyst has to be.
I think it's a good idea to be. Yes.
Because just the touching of the top of these tubes and then the touching of the next one can cause can cause cross-contamination.
Well, not so much from the outside of the tube. I mean, it's not that there's a problem with it on the outside. As long as you spin that down, that's the main thing, so that you don't have any liquid up near the top of the tube. I think that's what you mean.
Now, let's go to H.
Okay.
We're actually looking at H. I'm looking at the clock before I go into H. This might
I'm
be
looking at
different.
the clock too before you go into H. We did good. We didn't hit the 2-hour mark today, but we went over every other day, so we're good. We're good. We're good. It's Saturday. I want to go out and play. Thanks for coming out, guys. I appreciate it. I'll see you all again real soon. Bye.